because it's a very important moment in history and because this is happening. Web3 is happening, it's emerging. I don't like everything that I see that's happening, but the potential and promise is so great. It's time for us to actually shape this conversation and bring in that human energy. So that's really at the heart of it. We've had a few people this morning talking about some of the cyber scams that are going on and rug pulls and all this other new lingo of ways to get kind of screwed by people. Not people, criminals, let's be honest, they're criminals. And people who put together these projects with the express intent of actually taking your money and running. How do we know who to trust? That's kind of one of the big issues that we have. But I am actually here to talk about something else. I want to get direct to the issue at hand. The theme of this event, as we've looked at from the very beginning, based on Bill Leiter's powerful question of what will it take? And if you didn't get to see him earlier, you definitely want to check out some Bill Leiter's other works and check out his book, Mastering Your Balance. But realize very early that that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to unlock people's full potential to think about this without their self-limiting beliefs, without their focus on what is, to really imagine what might be, unconstrained or unburdened by the past. So let's dive right into it. In fact, more to that point, if I may, what we actually talked about earlier, and I briefly mentioned this in the opening, is that the promise of Web3 for myself is to create a more equitable, a more fair, and a more inclusive economy. Now, it's much more than this, and it's different things to different people, and certainly it is about the technologies. But more broadly, as we've talked about it and generally agreed with top leaders in the industry, it's just a banner, a flag, a symbol behind which we can put our energy. And the more positive energy we get into it, the more positive outcomes we will get from it. If you saw Michael Moon's session earlier, he has a newer version of this graphic that I need to get a hold of from him. But the way that I look at this is formed by our Waymakers group in a conversation with Stephen Gans, Michael Moon, Bill Leiter, and so many other people within our group. Well, we recognized, and I think it was Michael who first kind of pointed it out, that what we're doing is we're transitioning from the sharing economy to the co-ownership economy, from the creator economy to the co-creator economy. Now that might not seem like much of a difference, and maybe it is to you. I hope it is, because the idea of doing it together is what we're talking about. For a long time, I've actually realized that the most important thing that we really need to do is figure out how to work well with others. And that is really the key to unlocking the greatest potential value that we can create together. Set aside our egos, find a way to communicate past language that is not familiar to us, and connect with each other. And then, of course, we get into team intelligence and so much more. But the point being is that there is another wave of massive societal transformation underway. We're just beginning, depending on which way you look at it. And we need to actually shape it to make sure it heads in the right direction. Esther Crawford, senior project manager at Twitter at the time, oh gosh, it still had the old logo on it. Imagine that. We were going to be a DAO at one point. Imagine that. We still will be, by the way, and I'll share more about that in a minute. Maybe that's actually an early preview. But it means that all value that's created can be shared amongst more people rather than just the owners, investors, and employees. You know, for a long time, as people have talked about, you don't own your brand anymore for your business, that customers do. Well, I've always kind of thought that we co-owned it with the brands and that they actually still had to deliver on it, and they owned the experience of their brands. They owned their values in action, but ultimately it was how we received it that really changed things. But again, it's this greater potential to transform society, to make a more inclusive economy that is really driving me now. And that's a very personal experience for me. And that personal experience comes from not necessarily an overly challenging childhood, although it wasn't the easiest. It wasn't the hardest by any means. But it taught me to value people. It taught me to value relationships. And with my mother, who had cerebral palsy, it taught me that anybody can do anything if they set their minds to it. And certainly that's the belief that she instilled in me. And that's why I'm standing here now, and showing me the courage to go ahead and put it forward, even when you weren't 105% certain of things. but that we could be open to this conversation. We could talk about these things together. But what I want to get into again is what will it take? And what I believe it will take is trust. As I mentioned earlier this morning, you can't have trustless tech without more trust. It's also going to take a secure green infrastructure. We heard Bram Cohen talking a little bit of that this morning, and some of the ways his architectural approach to chia.net is actually delivering on that green promise. And of course, because it's one of their values, it's something that they measure and they continually strive to improve. So even just having that on the radar as one of the key considerations in design is a huge step forward. And of course, we love Brand for a long time. We've been good fortune to know him and work with him in the past and spend time with him, and just really so inspired by his humility, his integrity, and his brilliance behind it. But also here again, we already have some guidance on what we need to do to be green, to have sustainable infrastructure, and that's United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. What we also need, and that's not so obvious inside of this, is a fair way to measure value. And that's something that's very hard to do, because our value and how we value things changes based on the moment in which we're standing. That makes it a real challenge to say at any given moment what we agreed to a year ago is still the same sort of value we have today. And that creates a lot of tensions perhaps into the interpersonal relationships or professional relationships that are not always easy to resolve. But what we really need is not only a real respect for human capital, we need a real respect for each other as humans, regardless of our station in life, regardless of what role we serve on a team or inside of an organization or within a community. We need to just be more respectful of each other. And of course, in the US here especially, we've seen too much of that fade away over the last couple of years. And we need to bring it back. And we need to find a way to talk with one another and talk with one another with respect. This is why actually, what I believe, what it will really take is a guild. A guild, yes, like the guilds of old, but it's a group of people who have come together in support of a given profession in the way that I'm looking at it. There's multiple ways to look at it. But in 19, oh my gosh, okay. So I keep going back to the beginning because I have been thinking about community as a driving organization to create value for some time. But more specifically and more recently in 2019, there goes my 19, I started looking at the world differently when I served as an entrepreneur in residence at an accelerator down in Queensland, Australia, where we worked primarily with the creative enterprises. Now, for a long time, independent professionals have been leaving organizations and going out on their own. And we've seen the rise of the creator economy. We've seen the rise of independent artists, and obviously NFTs create a good venue in which they can get discovered. And we've seen the rise of individuals with the benefit of all these technologies that I've got sitting here in front of me right now to be as powerful as any organization. And of course, a small group of determined individuals can truly accomplish anything. But for me, what the Guild does is provides a framework. It provides a mechanism through which we can actually have shared values, measure those values in action, and collaborate together. And that's really what I'm looking at. How can we collaborate together? And in fact, when we really look at this and the idea of bringing these shared values of purpose-driven organizations and heart-centered leadership, when we bring that into bear and we realize that we want to see more of that in the world, and we want to serve people who share those values with us, this isn't just a guild that I'm imagining. It's actually a guild of guilds, because we're not going to be able to reach scale of tens of thousands, or even 100 necessarily very easily. You can look at Dunbar number. You can look at so many other things. Of course, in the Valley, we talk about, is it a 1 pizza team or 2 pizza team, or, oh, it's a 3 pizza team. We need to break it up and get into smaller teams. But part of the idea here is that we've seen that teams have become the atomic unit of getting work done in organizations. And yes, individuals can take on individual tasks, and the new system of Web 3.0 really has bounties and grants and so many other ways to incentivize individual contributors. But those same mechanisms also incentivize teams. And I believe that teams will end up being the units that actually drive forward all of this change. So when I'm talking about a guild of guilds, what I'm looking at is the idea that while we all share these common values and we want to advance them together, there's a small group of people with whom we'll be interacting on a regular basis, delivering our projects. For those of you who have heard of Silicon Valley and some of the tales of what creates its success, you may be familiar with the concept that teams will literally go from one company to another, to another, to another. Sometimes it's not all consistent. It's not leaving company A to go to company B. It happens many years later. But when we find people who we gel with, who we can work with, where we share each other's values, where we understand each other, when we work well, where we have that mutual respect, that is really a unique experience. And it's actually the hardest part of building an organization, is creating that sense of team, that sense of teamwork, and being able to improve our team intelligence by bringing in one new person to shift the dynamics of that team. And of course, as Bill Leiter and Michael Moon and others have talked about earlier today, it ends up being about organizational culture. So some time ago, I had the good fortune of meeting Tom Chi when he was at a accelerator incubator in San Francisco called The Factory. And he shared this slide. So I didn't give full credit to it, but Factory X was the name of that company, I guess, at the time. Tom Chi was one of the original founders of Google X, of the labs that they actually built over there. Oh my gosh, how can I forget that name? It's been forever. I'm so sorry. I haven't had it in front of me. But he actually did the first prototype of Google Glass. And I always bring this up when I'm talking to innovators or entrepreneurs because it's quite a stunning story. Wondering if you actually have any idea how much time it took him to build that first prototype for Google Glass. It's quite remarkable because it was only about 30 minutes where they took a pair of sunglasses, strapped an Arduino to the side, threw some basic programming in there, and had the glasses on, and were able to start prototyping it right away. He also taught me a lot about the idea of rapid prototyping, that we don't need to build applications fully functional and high resolution to code. If we could just simply test them with pieces of paper and human interaction to kind of run a director-based cinematic. But what this slide spoke to for me in particular is the problem with the old version of capitalism that we are fixing with this new version of capitalism. And that's that for a long time, organizations or companies existed to take away from individuals in society. They took what they could from their employees, ground them when they could ground them. They didn't necessarily always care about them. Well, of course, the best companies did. But when we start looking at this, what would happen if we could flip the model? What would happen if we went from a world in which companies were doing this to one in which the organizations and companies were lifting individuals in society, creating this not only instantiation of co-elevation, but literally existing to lift the individual and lift society. And at the heart of what we're doing here with Web 3.1 is that spirit. And to that extent, I really want to thank you, Tom, for sharing your insights and for all you've done over the years to help drive forward innovation and a different way of thinking about how we can actually start companies together and what that means. And of course, what it's really about is understanding that not only in today's era with the power of the computing technology we have, with what's emerging with Web3 for transferring and transacting value, human capital is more valuable than venture capital. And together, you and I, right now, this afternoon, if we were to have a chat at the end of this session, could go off and create a new organization, could get it built, could possibly get it launched, could find a client and get that all done in under a day without having to use venture capital, because we can use our smarts, the tools that are at our fingertips, and the very limited resources that are already in play for what we're doing here through technologies like this hop-in platform. But it's about, again, respect for the other human as much as it is their human capital. And what we found is that really organizations themselves, what they provided for us in many ways, at least in the consulting and in the knowledge worker space and in many of the technology companies, is a legal, financial, and reputational framework or foundation upon which we can live and give our gifts to the world. Now, of course, over the years, we found that the politics inside these organizations and so much more was immensely challenging. Uh, Gosh, I don't know how many times I've had to do something that I thought was so stupid because somebody with a better title thought that's what needed to be done. And because of that title, we had to give them respect, not because they earned it, not because they were kind and caring, but because they had a title. There's a lot more to talk about there, but that's a really deep subject. And of course, there's a lot of other examples that speak to situations in which we do need to give respect to the title because it has been earned. And they may not have ways in which we agree with all the time in terms of how they approach collaboration with us, but they have the experience, they have the wisdom, and they're trying to get those objectives accomplished, which is where the key to doing that is alignment, which is why I turn back to the Guild and the idea of being aligned around shared values of serving purpose-driven organization and heart-centered leaders. But when we start looking at our history of organizations, we see some very simple patterns. There's a sole proprietorship, there's partnerships, like my wife and I have with Ad Hocnium right now. We're the two owners and partners of Ad Hocnium as of today. But then there's other ways we can create limited partnerships that actually define differently the terms that we actually have with one another. There's also, of course, a standard corporation that we've heard so much about, a legal entity that constitutes being a human being. Well, a lot of other stuff to talk about there we don't need to get into. An LLC, a nonprofit, and a co-op. For those of you not familiar with DAOs, DAOs are in essence a form of a co-op that are run on the blockchain using code. Smart contracts, and they'll typically have a treasury, or as Michael Moon actually shared with me some time ago, the DAO is sort of like a project team with a shared treasury. Similar to what Michael Liskin was talking about in the kibbutz that he encountered and worked with over in Israel some time ago. But when we start looking at this and we start thinking of the idea of the independent consultant and how so many people, and particularly over the last year, has embraced the Great Resignation and moved forward to leave their jobs to become independent. Sometimes perhaps with other jobs lined up, sometimes with other startups lined up, but oftentimes just to go ahead and work for themselves. One of the things that I've experienced in the years is I'm not a full stack independent consultant. I can do a lot of things. I can produce a show. I can cut video. I can do some mediocre graphics every now and then. I can write things occasionally when I'm in the right mood. I can get things done. I can solve problems. I can do a lot, but I still can't do it all. It requires a team. It requires working with other people. It's where I probably first learned, and not because I was good at it, but because I was bad at it, that the most important thing in a knowledge economy for creating value and co-creating value now is the ability for smart people to work well together, to put aside their egos and to find out what is it that we're really good at, to admit those vulnerabilities, but also to focus in the areas of positivity, to choose our lanes, to choose our path, and to choose to forego what might be a natural reaction. Myself, like Peter Shankman and many of you out there, I imagine, have had different struggles with ADD over the years. When I first discovered the Howl book, the hunter-farmer sort of analogy, I was like, oh my gosh, this explains everything, right? But that just makes me do things like I just did, which is go off on a tangent, which is wrapping it in more. But the point being, still at the end of the day, nobody's perfect. I'm, in fact, the most perfect example of an imperfect human being you could ever look at. I've learned over the years to overcome some of my challenges from ADD, some of my challenges from how I grew up and how I learned. And I still have much more to go. And that's why we really talk about the idea that none of us are masters, but where we can come together. And one of the kind of entry level points to join the guild and to be a part of the guild that we're imagining and that we're putting together here is the understanding that I'm not a master, but I'm pursuing mastery, because every day I learn, whether it's from people like Agustin Cortez and what he's doing with Learnio, LIRN.io, and what he's doing with the non-transferable tokens, or if it's moving into meeting another master or mentor like Dr. Elizabeth Lindsay, with so much to share and touching my heart so deeply, and so grateful to have her and have her share her thoughts with Michael Liskin today. But what this really comes down to at the end is that I still have a reputation with all those imperfections and all the good things that I try to do and all the kind words that people have shared about me today and about my wife, Christy. It still comes down to need to manage that reputation, need to show up, need to kind of keep getting better, and need to actually manage that reputation so that others can actually find us and know that we are to be trusted, to know that we have a certain level of skill, to know that we have a reliable reputation, that people can rely on us to get things done because we are people of our word and we do what we say we will do, and that we're able to do it, that we actually know what we're talking about. And not only that, but we've actually done it before, or if we haven't done it before, to at least explore the possibilities that this is something that we can learn together with integrity and with humility and with that sense of going along the journey together. So the original Ad Hocnium vision was multifold. It came out of the social media era for sure, so Web 2.0. And what I was looking at was a very basic model where, as an agency, we needed to have more elasticity in our overhead. We didn't need to be able to take on so much fixed cost every month. And what I also found is that some of the smartest people I knew were entrepreneurs who were busy with other things. Now, since then, there's been a whole bunch of other organizations that have sprouted up, like 10X and others that kind of address this in different ways. But I was able to bring together a group of different talents with different backgrounds and experiences and put them into work in support of transforming and building value for different companies in different situations. And of course, we've had the good pleasure of working with Lenovo and Southwest Airlines and Intel and Ancestry.com and so many other big brands. And more recently, a few others that I'm not able to name right now, but I'm very excited about some of that other work, which we can't necessarily share with you. But the fruits of that labor, we've actually consolidated into some intellectual property, and we will be sharing and writing more about in the months to come. But what it comes down to, and what my experience has been over the years working on this, including years where actually Bill Leiter, as I mentioned to you, if you saw before, one of my mentors, I met Bill actually because the vice chairman of Deloitte had asked Bill, his friend, to interview me on my way into Deloitte to see if there's any warning flags or anything that he should be worried about, typical sort of vetting for that type of job going into Deloitte as a game changer to help lead their social business practice. I'm sorry, I'm just going back. I miss Eric. Eric, unfortunately, passed away a number of years ago, and he was a good guy. I really enjoyed learning from him. We spent some time working together on this idea of the network agency and how Deloitte might actually evolve to become more of a network agency. It didn't take hold at the time, but I have a sense that it is now. But as we move forward into today, this is what brings me back to rethinking Ad Hocnium, not as a network agency, but as a guild, as a new way of approaching that consulting business, that professional advisory business, coaching, mentorship, and so much more. And at the heart of it all is us respecting one another, of putting aside the politics, of figuring out that the purpose of why we are together here today is much greater than any one of us. But it requires each of us to be there, to contribute, to be a part of it. It requires a new way to look at the organization, not just to understand that the organization can exist to lift individuals in society, but how the very nature of it is structured in terms of creating a professional network we can co-own, where we own our own data, our content, our reputation, and revenue streams we co-create with one another. This is why one of the things that's really going to take is to figure out how we measure value fairly, equitably, and that we do it transparently. And that is actually in the heart, in the guts of tokenomics, which makes it really, really exciting as I start looking to this new digital empowerment that's provided by the DAO, by tokenomics, and by so much more. It opens up the ability for us all to come together and ultimately build this organization, not to compete with the big four, but to be, as I look at it, the big one, an overwhelming force for good in the world, because we know that it's up to us to make it that way. We know that we have the power to come together with other like-minded individuals with different backgrounds, different cultures, and different experiences in pursuit of one common goal. We can build a better tomorrow, but first we have to design it together. We have to figure out how to get along, and we have decades and decades of research and experience that can inform us. So it can't just be the millennials. It can't just be Gen Y or whatever the next generation is called, just as it couldn't be Gen X when I started my first internet company in 94. We had to build bridges across the generations. And so a big part of what we're doing here is that intergenerational wisdom transfer that would allow us to take the energy of our positivity and positive intents to create not only a force for good, but a force for sustaining good people like you, for ensuring that there's work for you to do and that you're able to get rewarded, not only in terms of financial compensation, which is really important, but as I've looked at my life and the blessings that I've been able to have that allow me to live and give my gift to the world, on every project that I approach, I have 3 dials. How much money do I need? How much equity do I want? And what is the social impact / intrinsic value of this effort to me? And that's where, we wanted to make this free to open this up, because I recognized that the social impact was worth much more than the financial impact for myself. My wife may disagree with that a little bit, but we'll skip that for now, right? But what it will take in wrapping up here as we come to the last few minutes, in my mind, again, is a guild. I do believe that we are living in the Gilded Era. Now, there's a lot of different examples out there. In fact, we could talk about them all day, but one in particular that I'm hopeful that you're aware of, and you might not think of this way, is Lambda School. And what they're doing, what Austin Allred and his team have done to create the ability to educate this next generation of coders, not for money up front, not for some promise of future jobs, but for real jobs in real work that they can vouch for in organizations that need great people through income sharing agreements. And this is just one way that guilds are now entering into our society. And it's part of this model that we're going to learn from and build on. Now, as I close up here, just a few thoughts, and I'll be heading right off and getting ready for the next session. Hopefully you've seen this idea of WAGMI. We are all, there's kind of a double A in there, we are all going to make it. I love this philosophy, and I think it's spot on, except it's also off. We aren't all going to make it unless we all put in the work, unless we learn to work well together, unless we find new models for valuing our contributions, if we find new ways to respect each other and understand that the receptionist, the coder, the VP of sales, they all have different roles, but as human beings and as parts of our team, they're equally valuable. And we need to find that respect for each other in order to move forward through this. So at the end of the day, what it all is up to us. And that's what I'm inviting you to do with us, is to explore further as we move into this next phase. And in fact, look out in the coming weeks for our next event, Web 3.11. Sorry, it just makes things a little simpler, I think. But we're going to have a session together, similar to what we're going to do tomorrow at the end of the unconference, using a World Cafe, to discuss what would this DAO look like? How would we be able to determine the valuations that we provide for each other's contributions? How will we measure our contributions? How will we design a better world together, and do that in service of organizations large and small, and particularly do that in service of getting more organizations established as DAOs, where more people can live and give their gift to the world and do so sustainably and reliably. Thank you so very much for your time and listening to me today. I'm Chris Heuer, founder of Ed Hockney, co-host here of Web 3.1 with Tina Hui. I hope you have a great afternoon and that we see you tonight at our networking session at 5:30 p.m., where we'll kick off the unconference and share some of the ideas that we have for topics tomorrow. And we'll be able to get ready for a great unconference day ahead on March 1st. That's tomorrow.